Yeah, hi there. These comments are for Armine. This is Michael, the founder, owner, and the materials writer for the 7-step system to pass the TOEFL IBT. And I think you're moving up. You just completed one of my integrated writing practice tests, and you've paid to get the additional feedback to have me edit and give you additional comments about your writing. I got good news for you. I think that this essay, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think you're probably at least 3.75 to 4.0 out of 5, putting you between about 24 and 25 points out of 30. So I think that you understand the reading. I think that you understand the lecture. I think you've done a pretty good job connecting the information. So those are some of my comments. Now, during the video right now, I want to go through your essay on 2 levels. The first level is I want to pay really close attention to your sentence style and any possible editing, grammatical issues, any problems with punctuation, and those kinds of things, right? Now, the second time, I'll edit your essay more for content and structure, and then really see how well it's organizing around the writing assignment. Okay, so you have the reading passage tells us about ethanol and its usage, whereas the listening passage, and I would just use simple present, that's what you're using in the beginning anyway. So you just say talks, how about discusses, maybe a little bit better word, discusses mostly about, I'm going to put the in there, the advantages and the disadvantages of ethanol versus gasoline. Okay, so in this case, you say in the reading passage it is stated. That's a little bit too wordy. My second lesson in my grammar part of my course, I want you to take a look at that lesson. It will show you how to make your writing more concise. So I'm going to do this. Just say the reading passage states. You see that? That's a more direct way to say it. The reading passage states that ethanol is an alcohol-based fuel. Again, you don't really need to use, I think, the adjective clause here. And I don't even think you need that comma either. I'm going to just say produced by fermenting and distilling grains. Now, the reason I didn't put the comma there is if you say alcohol-based fuel, we're not really sure what that means. We know that it refers back to ethanol, but the actual idea of fuel, the adjective phrase after that is important for identifying the meaning there. So this is what's called a restrictive element, not a non-restrictive element, so I wouldn't use the comma there. Also, the reading passage is talking about ethanol. I think that's a little too wordy again. I'm going to say this is going to be a little bit more concise. The reading passage explains that ethanol 85 is a mixture of 85% of ethanol and 50% of gasoline. Usually we can say it this way, believe it or not. I know you want to put that prepositional phrase in there, but we can say this. The reading passage explains that E85 is a mixture of 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline, which is used as a fuel for cars made by the major auto manufacturers. Now let's take this. What we want here, we want to make sure this adjective clause is close to the word it modifies, and it's E85, right? So I'm going to cut that. I'm going to go here. Now we're getting into some fairly advanced grammar here. Now check that out. It says also the reading passage explains that E85, which is used as a fuel for the cars made by the major auto manufacturers, is a mixture of 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. Now this is going to throw you into some trouble right here, this particular word whereas. Now why is that? Whereas, Armine, this is a subordinating conjunction. It's used to join a independent clause and a dependent clause together. This would be introducing a dependent clause. However, you simply say the listening passage is talking about the advantages and disadvantages of ethanol. So what you can do is put the word however. However is a transition word that is used to introduce an independent clause. So however, listening passage, again, too wordy. If you want to use it that way, the listening passage talks about the advantages and disadvantages of ethanol. First, one of the disadvantages is that ethanol is more expensive and harder. Using E85 vehicles can get 10 to 20 fewer miles versus if gasoline would be used. I don't think using, I just think you want to say just that. E85 vehicles oh, I know what you want to say. I got it. You got a word order problem. So vehicles using E85. That's the grammar you're looking for right there. So vehicles using E85 can get 10 to 20% fewer miles versus, I'm going to say, again, let's see what we have here. Vehicles using E85 can get 10 to 20% fewer miles versus their gasoline-powered counterparts. I think that's a little bit more concise way to say that also. Then you say, also one might think that E85 fuel costs less, but the lecturer doesn't agree with that. Now be careful. You're getting into some what I call sentence formation issues. Now here's what we have to identify here. When we look at your other sentence, we have one is your subject, might think is a verb, then you have your connector here, right? Then you have the lecturer, and then you have doesn't agree as your verb there. But then you have as though it is, there are. You definitely need to end and begin with a new sentence here. As though, no. Even. You say E85 you might say, even though E85 fuel costs 65 cents less per gallon, I think you want to say here lecture. Let me check the notes here really quickly. Yeah, 60 cents less, not 65 cents. So be careful. Make sure you don't. You can paraphrase what you're doing, right? So even though E85 fuel costs 65 cents less per gallon than gasoline at the gas stations, there are not as many E85 gas stations available which makes it more expensive to supply. So I'm putting a comma after available. You're using which to kind of comment on the whole idea of that sentence, which makes it more expensive to supply. All right, let's go to your next paragraph. You say, secondly, there are truly I don't know truly is the right word here. There are also advantages. There are advantages of E85 as well. The major advantage is that E85 helps the environment I'm just checking out, correcting a spelling there, by producing by producing fewer greenhouse gases. Now I'm using fewer here because gases, you're using it as a count noun. Now if you use it as an uncount noun, like I'm putting less gas in my tank today than yesterday, I would use less. But greenhouse gases, there are many different gases, right? So I would use fewer in this case. But it does require fertilizers, which has its influence on the production. Yeah, fertilizers. And this I don't think you need a comma there. It has to be it's without apostrophe, because if you say it apostrophe s, you're trying to say it is. You do not want to say which has it is influence on the production. Okay, so let's go to your final paragraph. To summarize, both the reading and the listening passages, I'm not going to say are giving, it's not really needed, the present progressive there, give us a good idea of what ethanol is, how it is used, and all the pluses and minuses that come with it. Yeah, I'm going to probably change this. And say that. Now, why did I do that, do you think? Let's take a look at it again. To summarize, both the reading and the listening passages give us a good idea of what ethanol is, how it is used, and what its pluses and minuses are. Yeah, I'm using in this case and what its pluses and minuses are. I'm using the word its to refer to ethanol, right? How it is used. All right, let's check our spelling one more time. I think we're pretty good here. Okay, so far I went over your essay and I've looked at the editing aspects of it, right? And one of the things that stands out on my mind is wordiness. You're a little bit too wordy. In many cases, as I demonstrated as I was editing your essay, you can usually either combine some sentences together, you can reduce some of those clauses to either phrases or single words. And the other thing is your verb tense. The most popular verb tense in academic writing, Armine, really two verb tenses. The first one is the simple present and also the simple past. And for some reason you were using, I think, the present progressive, which I don't think was the right choice. So I changed a lot of your verb tenses to simply the simple present, which I think works better when you're summarizing. Okay, now let's get into the organization of it. Let's look more at the structure and the content of what you've done. Okay, one thing that you might do in the beginning is the reading passage tells us about ethanol and its usage, whereas the listening passage discusses mostly about the advantages and the disadvantages of ethanol versus gasoline. Now, the only thing that you've done, though, is in terms of your structure in your third paragraph, you started off with the advantages, no, with the disadvantages first, right? And then you went to the advantages. So I think it's probably better, because if you change this way, and then we do it that way, and we do the same thing here, it better matches how you've actually discussed that information. So that's one structural change I would make in terms of the thesis. But I think that your introduction is good in the sense that it connects. Now, my integrated writing of reading passages and lectures aren't as organized as what you would see on the TOEFL itself. Mine are much harder, and you're doing a pretty good job organizing them. Now, what you would do on the actual TOEFL is, here's exactly what would happen, I think, is you would read a passage which would discuss 3 positive aspects of ethanol. There would be 3. And then according to the lecture, there would be 3 what we call either disagreements or contradictions or disadvantages to each of those 3 points that were mentioned in the reading. That's what you're doing, really, is you take the 3 points from the reading, you have to match them up with the 3 points in the lecture, and then it becomes what I call point, counterpoint. Point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint again. Now, the first point would be the first point mentioned in the reading, and then the counterpoint would be the first point in the lecture which disagrees with that first point. Then you go to the next point in the reading, then you explain the counterpoint in the lecture which disagrees with that idea, then you discuss the third point in the reading, and then you discuss the third point in the lecture which disagrees with that idea. Now, there's different ways that you can do that. Armine is you can use what's called sequencing, which means you discuss the point and counterpoint in the same paragraph, right? Or you could use what's called chunking, which means you include the 3 points of the reading in the second paragraph, and then you include the 3 points of the lecture, or the 3 counterpoints of the lecture in the paragraph directly after that, right? So you can use either a chunking or a sequencing to organize those ideas. Now, I've noticed that you're using ethanol and also what's called E85, I think, to refer to the same thing. Am I right? So I think later on, where you do mention E85, you probably have to do something like the ethanol or E85. You might do something like that. That way, once you put or E85 in that line, that means the rest of the time you're using E85, we will know exactly what you're talking about. So you'll notice when you say E85 here, E85, E85 again, E85 here, so you're avoiding having to repeat the word E85 ethanol every time, right? Okay, so when we look at your second paragraph, and let me take a look at the reading. I think you're pretty good here. I don't see any major problems. You focused, I think, on the most important ideas. The reading passage states that ethanol, or E85, is an alcohol-based fuel produced by fermenting and distilling grains. Exactly. You say also the reading passage explains that E85, which is used as a fuel for cars made by the major auto manufacturers, I think we have to put one right here, by the manufacturers, is a mixture of 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. And then you have the chemical formula. Yeah, you probably have to say something a little bit more about these cars. These are specific types of cars, not just any car. I think according to the reading passage, they refer to these as flexible fuel cars which can run on gas and ethanol, right? So I think we have to clarify a point here in your second paragraph. The reading passage explains that E85, which is used as a fuel for specifically designed cars made by the auto manufacturers, yeah, I probably have to put it after. So the reading passage explains that E85, which is a fuel, which is used as a fuel for the specifically designed cars made by the major auto manufacturers, is a mixture of 85% ethanol and 50% gasoline. You say these flexible fuel vehicles use gas, E85, or both. I would put that in there. I think the reading does mention that. I think that's something that you don't want to leave out. Okay, now let's get to your next paragraph. So far so good, right? I think we're going in the right direction. However, the listening passage talks about the disadvantages and the advantages of ethanol. First, one of the disadvantages is that ethanol is more expensive and harder. And I think using the word harder is not, I think, going to work very well here. I think it is, as you're saying, it's more expensive, cars are more difficult to start in colder climates. And it says in here, you might not know what the word means. Where is it? Yeah, it says ethanol is harder to ignite in cold climates. Ignite means to burn. Remember, when you start a car, you have the spark plugs in the engine. I think the spark plugs have contact with the gas, and the spark plug makes a spark, ignites the gas burns, you create a controlled explosion which helps the car start. However, ethanol does not burn very well. It doesn't ignite in colder climates as well as gas, right? So that's what we're trying to put here. So this idea of harder, it doesn't really work. You just say harder, but you don't say harder what? I don't know what that word means. So cars are more difficult to start in colder climates because E85 more difficult to ignite. I don't know another synonym for that. Maybe burn, catch on fire. All right, so let's keep going. First, one of the disadvantages is that ethanol is more expensive and cars are more difficult to start in colder climates because E85 is more difficult to ignite. How about in addition? Vehicles using E85 can get 10% fewer miles versus their gasoline-powered counterparts. Also, one might think that E85 fuel costs less, but the lecturer doesn't agree with that. Here, let's take a look. Yeah, the reading passage doesn't really say that it costs less, but it does make the point, and you want to make sure you bring this out, that it uses fewer emissions. But there is an argument, I think, in the listening passage that disagrees with that idea. Let's keep going. So you say, in addition, vehicles using E85 can get 10% fewer miles versus their gasoline-powered counterparts. Also, one might think that E85 fuel costs less, but the lecturer doesn't agree with that. Let's make your writing a little more complicated. Because, comma, check this out. Even though E85 fuel costs 60 cents less per gallon than gasoline at the gas stations, there. I don't think it's a good idea to separate these sentences. You want to put them together. I know it's a long sentence, but follow the commas. Also, one might think that E85 fuel costs less, but the lecturer doesn't agree with that because even though E85 fuel costs 60 cents less per gallon than gasoline at the gas stations, there are not as many E85 gas stations available, which makes it more expensive to supply. We're using a lot of connectors already. We have the word that, we have because, we have even though, we have but. So we got to get rid of this connector here. I'm going to say hence, making it more expensive to supply. And this is, I think, the thing that you really need to point out a little bit more is, secondly, there are advantages of E85 as well. The major advantage is that E85 helps the environment by producing fewer greenhouse gases, but it does require fertilizers, which has its influence on production. Now, I think we might be running into some trouble here a little bit with this paragraph, so let's take a look at what it's saying, because if you look at the lecture, Armine, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's a yes and no. It says in the lecture, does ethanol help the environment? Yes and no. It burns cleaner than gasoline, so it emits fewer greenhouse gases. But the planting, maintenance, and the harvest of corn and other ethanol crops requires diesel fuel and petroleum-derived products like fertilizers and pesticides. So this erodes some of ethanol's benefits. It says, but as ethanol technology develops and genetically modified crops are planted in greater numbers, production is expected to become less energy intensive. And then the speaker says, I guess it's a mixed bag when it comes to using ethanol over gasoline as a fuel source. You have to say something like this, but how about but? Since ETH, ethanol is produced from corn crops, and we have to say but since ethanol is produced from corn and a few other crops, let's say is a little less green friendly. No, we're getting too wordy here. I gotta be more concise here. Hold on a minute. Planning, it requires the use of, it says diesel fuel petroleum driven products Yeah, the diesel fuel means the tractors and things. It requires the use of tractors and also products like fertilizers and pesticides, all of which you might say all of which diesel fuel and other derivatives of gasoline. Okay, I think we got it almost. So secondly, there are advantages of E85 as well. The major advantage is that E85 helps the environment by producing fewer greenhouse gases, but since ethanol is produced from corn and a few other crops, planting it requires the use of tractors and products like fertilizers and pesticides to encourage maybe growth and to kill weeds, which means maintain according to the lecture, all of which require diesel fuel and other forms of pesticides. Okay, then at the end you say, to summarize, both the reading and the listening passages give us a good idea of what ethanol is, how it is used, and what its pluses and minuses are. Alright, I think we got it. And I hate to bore you too much at this point, but let me go through the reading one more time, because I'm seeing this for the first time when you sent me the email, and I'm helping you right now, so there may be just a few more changes we might need to make. Hold on. The reading passage tells us about ethanol and its usage, whereas the listening passage discusses mostly about the disadvantages and the advantages of ethanol versus gasoline. The reading passage states that ethanol, or E85, is an alcohol-based fuel produced by fermenting and distilling grains. Also, the reading passage explains that E85, which is used as a fuel for the specifically designed cars made by the major auto manufacturers, is a mixture of 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. These flexible fuel vehicles use gas, E85, or both. However, the listening passage talks about the disadvantages and the advantages of ethanol. First, one of the disadvantages is that ethanol is more expensive and cars are more difficult to start in colder climates because E85 is more difficult to ignite. In addition, vehicles using E85 can get 10 to 20% fewer miles versus their gasoline-powered counterparts. Also, one might think that E85 fuel costs less, but the lecturer doesn't agree with that, because even though E85 fuel costs 60 cents less per gallon than gasoline, at the gas stations there are not as many E85 gas stations available, hence making it more expensive to supply. Secondly, there are advantages of E85 as well. The major advantage of E85 is that E85 helps the environment by producing fewer greenhouse gases, but since ethanol is produced from corn and a few other crops, planting it requires the use of tractors and products like fertilizers and pesticides to encourage growth and to kill weeds, all of which require diesel fuel and other forms of gasoline. To summarize, both the reading and the listening passages give us a good idea of what ethanol is, how it is used, and what its pluses and minuses are. Alright, we got it. So I think on this one, now that I've just spent 40 minutes going through the essay, I want to give you a little bit lower score than what I gave you in the beginning, but maybe that's not fair, because an IBT human rater, they will not spend 40 seconds on it. They're not going to spend any time on it. A computer's going to read it, I think, and then they might have a human rater right after that. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, if I did score it a little lower, I might score you at 3.5 instead of 3.75 to 4.0, but still, I think you have a very solidly written essay. I did make a few suggestions and some editing things within this video that you can see now before your eyes. But anyway, keep up the good work. Thank you for being a great student. And remember, if you like my course, tell somebody about it. Send them a quick email. Alrighty? Anyway, have a great day.